Welcome to the RedCouch.net's political podcast, brought to you by Johnsonville Bratwurstburgers. Do you like bratwurst? Do you really like bratwurst? But do you hate meat that's in a tube shape? I'm not here to question your insecurities or what might have happened to you as a child or your particular brand of phobias. What I'm here to do is introduce you to the new product that you'll really enjoy. It's everything you love about a bratwurst, but more American, in a hamburger shape, as God intended. Johnsonville Bratwurstburgers. Anything else is an affront to the image of God. All right, so I'm doing a very special teaser for the political podcast. Since this is the 4th of July, I figure it's a good time to talk about politics. I just want to start off real quick. This is going to be a pretty short teaser with the initial segment of going through and looking at sort of the headlines, what's going on today, and a little bit of commentary on that. The first thing that's happened today, and by the way, happy 4th of July. I hope everybody has great plans today. Be safe, enjoy times with your family, enjoy celebrating this wonderful country of ours that is America, however you see fit. The thing that is most pressing this morning, for those of you that have looked at the news, be it on actual printed paper, if for some reason you still do that, or on the web, the breaking news this morning is about North Korea testing a ICBM. That's an intercontinental ballistic missile, for those of you that don't know the acronyms. Basically, what happened this morning, well, I guess it was technically late last night. I don't know, time zones are a pain. There's so many of them. There's like, what, 20-ish? And you can never remember, are you moving forward, are you moving back? Who observes daylight savings time? Who doesn't? Why does daylight savings time exist? Why do I have to care what time foreigners think it is? Why can't everybody just be on American time? If American time was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for the rest of the world. In any case, on some North Korean time that I'm not going to bother to understand or calculate, Pyongyang launched a ICBM. Now, this is the first launch of an actual functional ICBM we've seen out of North Korea. North Korea has launched several what are intermediate range, shorter range ballistic missiles to varying degrees of success. Their telemetry equipment historically has not been great, but they've at least gotten these things off the ground and more or less functional. But ICBMs they've never been able to pull off, at least not till now. Every time they've launched an ICBM, it's failed miserably. Either it's basically blown up on launch, or it's quickly gone astray. They've been useless. This is the first successful test we've seen of an ICBM missile. Now, mind you, just because they've tested one ICBM doesn't mean they really have the technology to be mass producing and employing them in a real militaristic setting. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is they don't actually have a functional nuclear warhead, as far as we know, and nor is there any reason to think there's a functional nuclear warhead. Now, there is a concern in that we could have said the same thing about ICBMs as of 48 hours ago, that we did not believe they had anything close to a functional ICBM. We still thought they were years off, and that's the part that makes this so scary, is we don't know. We don't know where this came from. We don't know where they're at in this program, and it kind of really puts doubts on our intelligence overall, at least publicly available intelligence. Now, there's always the possibility that there's more that our government and other governments know than they're letting on. Bottom line is, though, we're at a time right now where, at very least, they have an ability to deliver a warhead of some sort to Hawaii and Alaska. That's about as far as this thing is going to reach. And also more concerning is Japan. Although their IRBMs before technically kind of put Japan within range, this puts real American military installations, real American soil, and pretty much all of the Pacific within their reach. They don't have anything that can reach the continental United States yet. That would be, I think it's somewhere around 1,500 miles longer than the range, the projected range of their current missile. But they're there. They're getting there. Really, once you make sort of the initial advancement of having a functional infrastructure in place, it's just a matter of upgrading the engines and the telemetry from there. So, by all reports, this is concerning. This is very concerning. What's more concerning is our reaction to it and how we handle it from here. And that is the part that has a lot of people very terrified. Obviously, we do not have the ideal president in place to be responding to these international crises. We also have a very delicate and contentious sort of diplomatic relationship when it comes to North Korea. We have South Korea, who's a very strong ally, has been for years, almost sort of a satellite state in some ways, does it, at least militarily speaking, not culturally. I mean, they're fully independent, obviously, but they, from a military standpoint, they're a very close ally. And obviously, we have Japan as well, and Japan's a very close ally as well. But Japan's still to this day somewhat restricted on their military capabilities, yet from World War II. And they're also somewhat restricted on their intelligence gathering capabilities as well. Uh, more so as a matter of pragmatism than anything else. But obviously, we have two very strong allies right there. And then the rest of the region is much more contentious. There's still a lot of bad blood from that whole Vietnam War debacle, and also obviously China, who's the superpower for the region, and us are frenemies, I guess might be the best way to put it. Generally speaking, China is more of an ally than a lot of politicians are willing to let on. They're a sensible economic world power that most of the time is functional, at least for us, on international terms. They're a country that we more or less get along with. The problem is Trump obviously has not done a particularly good job managing that relationship. He doesn't seem to have any goal or vision to what our alliance, what our relationship should be like with China. And he's just been all over the board on this. So we don't know quite how China is going to react to us and what actions we might take and to what point they're going to be beneficial or not beneficial to us. The other part of that equation is China also has an even more complicated relationship with North Korea. If China were a Facebook person and North Korea were a Facebook person, their relationship would be so complicated they wouldn't even put it's complicated. It would basically just be a bunch of passive aggressive sniping and vague booking back and forth between the two. North Korea is ostensibly an ally of China, and for all public appearances and support purposes and economic purposes, that is very much true. China does do a lot of economic support and even to some degree some military support. The problem is two things. One, North Korea isn't a big fan of China in some respects because the Kim Jong dynasty is very fond of being quite masculine and appearing quite independent and self-sufficient, even though that's not true really in any way. So they tend to take sort of an arm's length approach with China. And then on the flip side, China is fully cognizant of how crazy North Korea is and how volatile their leadership is and how secluded the country is. But North Korea is important to them as a military partner, much like South Korea is to us, and also is important to them as far as intelligence gathering, things like that go. So in turn, they do continue to fairly openly and to some degree really support North Korea, and North Korea is, like I said, ostensibly an ally to China. But there's always been this thought among intelligence circles that sooner or later there's going to be a breaking point. China does not want war with anybody, really. The last thing China wants is war. Not to say China doesn't have a good military in place. They do. They are a nuclear power. They have a pretty strong military. They have debatably the highest troop numbers of any country in the world, just because of their population. So China is a militarily strong country. They're still not as strong as we are. They don't spend anywhere near the amount of money that we do. Nobody does. But they make no mistake. If there was ever a real war, China definitely could keep its own. But the point is it's not that China's afraid of war. China doesn't want it. There's nothing beneficial to China of having any sort of major military conflict. China takes kind of sort of the opposite approach to America, whereas America is constantly using military might as a way of interfering with foreign affairs and for economic either improvement for us or for other countries, or to improve our sort of strategic, both economically and military strategic position. China is much more isolationist. China much more prefers to control things behind the scenes. They prefer to use their own economic might behind the scenes to exert influence over the rest of the world, and they're very good at it. China's been very good at that over the last 30 years. War, especially in that region, could really put a damper in it. Additionally, China is concerned about war in that region because they're in that region. They are right there. They are could potentially be ground zero for the beginning of any sort of nuclear conflict. So they don't want anything to happen that's going to rock sort of the status quo that they've well established. They also have a sort of dominance in Southeast Asia that they like, both politically and economically, that North Korea could potentially threaten. So generally, the consensus is that sooner or later, China would step up. The problem is we don't know where we're at, and we don't know to what degree China is going to step up in a way beneficial to us versus beneficial to China. We don't know how well our interests coincide, so it's scary, and I actually can't emphasize how disconcerting this news is, and how seriously we need to take it, and how people need to pay attention. This is a big deal. Like I said, nothing's going to happen tomorrow. There's not any indication that North Korea can pose any sort of serious nuclear, or really even military threat in the immediate future, but we're reaching a breaking point. And the problem is if we wait until they actually pose that threat, it's probably going to be too late to effectively do something. Interdiction has to happen soon in order for it to be effective. And the question is it going to be a bilateral interdiction with us and China? I mean, it would be more than bi, where you would also see European, Japanese, South Korean involvement as well, but we would be the spearheads. Or is it going to be some degree a unilateral approach with us and our allies to do something? And if it is unilateral, to what degree are we going to be able to do it? If it is bilateral, to what degree is China going to be involved? How are they going to take a position? And a lot of that is just, it's not known right now. It's definitely not publicly known. A lot of the information out there about this, there's a lot out there, and I encourage a lot of people to read up. But a lot of it is sort of confidential. I mean, first of all, we don't really know that much about North Korea. North Korea is very secretive. Intelligence gathering there tends to be kind of dodgy because of the nature of the country. And the intelligence that is gathered is largely not publicly disseminated. So while our government has a lot of stuff they know about that area that none of us in the public know, from a kind of consensus building standpoint, building any sort of popular support for one action or the other, because of that, it's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really difficult for Americans to support a military action. It's going to be really difficult for Americans to support non-military action. So it's a tough road ahead. It's a scary road ahead. There's a lot of ways this can get screwed up. I mean, this is maybe the most pressing diplomatic and economic concern that we've had for a while. We can't afford to screw up Southeast Asia. We just can't. So we'll have to monitor that over the coming days. Like I said, nothing's going to happen tomorrow, but things are going to start happening, and we need to pay attention. It is way more important than Trump's Twitter. It's way more important than even healthcare. I mean, this is a pressing concern. You need to put some mental capital into this. So beyond that headline, there's a couple of other really minor things that have come out that are sort of interesting. So let me just hit those real quick, and then I'm going to leave you with a message for the 4th of July. The next thing that sort of happened today is there was a ruling that has come out recently, and again, I can't recall if this was last night or if this was this morning. This was late last night. The news hit that the D.C. Appeals Court has blocked some of the things that the EPA is doing, some of the things Scott Pruitt's doing with the EPA. Basically what they're doing is they're doing an administrative rollback of Obama-era regulations while they themselves draft and put new regulations into place. Now, the thing that's interesting is, so there's this concept of federalism. For those of you that don't maybe have as much legal education as I do, federalism basically means it's the divided powers. I mean, that part you learned about in school, the three branches of government, and also there's federalism as relates from the government to the states. Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking more about the division of powers. There's a ton of Supreme Court and lower court and just case law in general about this sort of division of powers and to what degree the legislative, executive, judicial can all interact. In fact, it's a good chunk of most of the Supreme Court stuff actually deals with that aspect of it, of the cases over the year from the Supreme Court. What is less developed is within a given department, with given agencies, how these sort of things are handled. What we're dealing with here with the EPA is we're dealing with internal regulatory standards, and there's certain processes that the EPA has to go through, and the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, the courts in general, the judiciary holds them to those processes to one degree or the other. And what's happening here, basically, from what I've read, and I'm by no means an expert on the regulatory state. It's not my ball of wax, but from what I get, there are these Obama era regulations that the EPA wants to rewrite, and they can pretty much do that. They're allowed to rewrite their own internal regulations to the degree that it does not interfere with laws, with actual legislative things. So basically, what happens anytime you have a executive agency do something, there is some sort of broader law that's put into place that either creates the agency and delegates powers to it, or a law that says we want the agency to act in such and such way, and then they get to draft their own regulations to how to carry out that law. And as long as what they do is within the spirit of their charter, within the spirit of statutes and legislative action, they're pretty much allowed to do their own regulatory stuff any way they want. And that's sort of what this deals with, is how the EPA is handling their own internal regulatory state. The problem is they still have to follow some basic sort of legal processes. They are not allowed to just abandon regulations without replacing them with other regulations, because now they're starting to get into the problem where they're violating sort of the legal tenets that establish them. So that's basically what the DC court said, is they want to rewrite these regulations. That's great, they can do it, but they've got to go through the proper process, and until they rewrite them, until they actually get new regulations in place, they have to keep following the old regulations. So they enjoined the suspension of Obama-era emission standards. So that's what it boils down to, is there are certain emission standards that the EPA wanted to stop enforcing, wanted to suspend, while they're drafting new emission standards, and the DC court, the DC circuit said, no, you can't do that. You got to keep following through with that. It's boring, and I apologize for boring you. This is not exciting. This is not great stuff for the general public. It's not sexy. But it is important, because we're seeing a lot of this with Trump, because Trump's gone so much through executive action and through the regulatory state and through his cabinet and administrative powers, that it's really opening this sort of whole I won't say brand new world, because Obama did it too. Obama really kind of laid the groundwork for it, and even Obama can't really be blamed entirely for it, because it's this sort of bipartisan progression towards this over the last several presidents. Reagan did a little bit, Clinton did a little bit, W did a lot more, Obama did a lot more, and now Trump's doing it just at a rate that outpaces all of them. So we've been headed this way anyway. But Trump has really taken this ball and run with it. So now it's going to be interesting to see, as this does go on, how the courts handle it, to what degree there's judicial interference, to what degree there's deference to it, and just how these things unfold. And this is obviously going to end up with the Supreme Court, so we're going to get some interesting cases out of that. So anyway, that's worth paying attention to. It's going to be a pressing issue for a while to come. The last article that I saw that was interesting today is about ISIS, that the U.S.-backed forces have made a pretty decent military advancement today, basically breaching into what is ostensibly one of the capital cities of ISIS, the Syrian city of Raqqa. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize to anybody if I'm slaughtering your native tongue. But the story itself is not particularly interesting. What is interesting is the sort of underreporting of our war against ISIS, our war against terrorism, which actually is going relatively well. It's going as well as it can. We're never going... This whole war on terror thing is such a... I don't even know quite how to describe it. It's like a shell game or a whack-a-mole. We keep thinking we know what we're doing, and then something else pops up, things change. It's a nightmare, and it's going to remain a nightmare. But to the extent that our particular objectives and goals are being advanced in any degree right now, they are advancing. ISIS is weaker than it's ever been. We've actually been very successful in curtailing ISIS. The reason why this is important and interesting is not because of our overall military success, which is dubious at best, but it does reflect on this drum beating, this pounding of this terror, constantly being afraid of terror. Got to be afraid of terror. They're out there to get us. We got to fight them, blah, blah, blah. we've actually done a pretty good job of it. Terrorism is not anywhere near as advanced or as structured or as well supplied as it was a few years ago. We've really hurt ISIS a lot. It doesn't mean we're not still going to suffer terror attacks, because the problem is a lot of this terrorism is very decentralized. These are smaller cells, sometimes even individual people, uh, and it doesn't take a whole lot of resources for these people to become actionable. Honestly, to build improvised explosives and strap yourself down with guns, is something that can be done for a few $1,000s. And if you can find, someone to supply with the money, or even if these people of their own free will want to put this money together, they're going to be able to assemble these arsenals and commit these terrorist attacks. They just are. There's really not much we can do about that. It's going to happen. Now, I mean, there are things we can do about that, and that's a whole different podcast. But what I want to focus on as far as this article goes, and what I want to kind of bring to the public forefront, the public attention, is that we have made good progress. And when you start hearing people pounding this drum of terror, you got to be afraid. You got to be afraid. We need more. We have to restrict more immigration. We need more military spending. Da 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 da. Take it with a grain of salt, because we really don't. We've actually done an effective job curtailing this. Overall, where we're at right now, don't let the headlines of these isolated incidences, which sometimes are very bad, especially the UK ones. The UK ones are terrifying, but don't let those paint the greater picture, because they aren't represented with the greater picture. The greater picture is that we're actually doing pretty well, and that terrorism really is not the threat that it once was. So try to keep that in mind. Try to read up on it. Again, it's sort of the recurring theme of this and a lot of other future podcasts is going to be is keep yourself informed. Pay attention to what is actually going on, not what people tell you is going on. Actually read and read various sources. Again, I can go on for a while about this, but as it relates to terrorism, we're doing okay. We don't need an immigrant ban. We don't need a wall. We don't need to increase military spending to the even more obscene level when it's already obscenely above what anybody else spends. What we do need is we need to be smarter, and we need some different strategies, because what we're doing right now really isn't working in the long term, for a bunch of reasons. But that's a different debate. That's a different conversation to have about how we improve to do more as far as diplomatic and cultural influence, to do more as far as economic development, stuff like that. And I can talk more about that later. But just keep in mind it's a much more complicated issue than what would be painted. And don't spend the rest of your life afraid of terrorism. You're far more likely to die driving on an American highway than you are to be a victim of terror. Far more likely. You're far more likely to die from a heart attack while driving, because you were struck by lightning, than you are from pretty much any act of terror. So just try to keep that in mind, try to keep some perspective. So those are the main headlines for today. And the last thing I want to leave you with, since it is the 4th of July, is a reading of a segment from the Declaration of Independence. Now, a lot of people are very cursorily familiar with, cursorily? Is that the word? Cursory? They have a cursory familiarity with the Declaration of Independence, basically just based upon the one passage. And it's not even show of hands who here. So the passage I'm talking about, obviously, is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator, blah, blah, blah. That line, who here thinks that is the opening to the Declaration of Independence? Spoiler alert, it is not. It is actually the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, but it's pretty much the only part most people know. The Declaration of Independence itself is not as sexy as that opening line would lead you to believe. It's essentially a redressing of grievances. It is a list of all of the reasons why the colonies feel they must rebel against the king. And it's also important historically to remember that when the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, when it is actually sent off, the Revolutionary War had already started at that point. Battles were already occurring. Everybody knew we were in full revolt. So it wasn't really what started American Revolution, American independence, but it was sort of what solidified it. And a big part of how it got solidified was this redressing of grievances, this listing of the reasons why we were doing this. And that's the part I really want to focus on. So I'm going to read from, this is somewhere around halfway through, the redressing of grievances. And mind you, the he that this is referring to is King George, is the British monarchy. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. So I think it's important to keep in mind as we move forward from this July 4th and every July 4th from here on out, the reasons why this country was founded, and the reasons why we waged our war against Britain, and the reasons why we felt so compelled to throw off King George and his crown. And with that, I will leave you. I will leave you to your wonderful beer, your wonderful barbecue, your wonderful families, your friends, your fireworks, and everything you love about this joyous of joyous holidays. I wish you all well. I still do not have a good sign-off line. If you could think of one, feel free to contact me and let me know. But for now, happy 4th of July, happy Independence Day, happy America.